Well, good evening and welcome to the final SCAMP event of this season on Ferns for events in rooms. And this event is about the history of the Solway and shipping, how the ships have got here. We've got expert speakers here, but very quickly, a little bit about what SCAMP is. SCAMP stands for Solway Coast and Marine Project, and basically it's a deep dive into repairing and restoring habitats along the Solway. And we're looking at marine habitats of starting furthest out the oyster reefs, and then seagrass meadow. We're then looking at restoring salt marsh, sand dune systems, and coastal woodland. It's a 10-year project. We don't know if we've got all of the money yet, but we're starting anyway with some of the work. We'll know more by sort of Friday this week, early next week, about the whole length of the project, but we're doing these events to try and promote the Solway and get people to start looking out at the sea as much as anything else. And whilst it's mainly about habitat restoration, it's really important that it's also about the culture of the Solway. There's a deep and often forgotten culture for the length of the Solway. And we're looking at the whole of the Dumfries and Galloway coastline from Stranraer all the way around to Gretna. So it's an amazing habitat which has largely been ignored, and over the next 10 years we're going to try and get some excitement about it and do lots of restoration. Now tonight is about a part of that culture around the shipping and how the shipping operated in the region. And we've got some great speakers tonight, so without further ado I'm going to bring the first one up. He was the founder, one of the founding members of Dumfries Archival Mapping project. He's a font of historical knowledge. He will tell you all that knowledge, whether you want to or not, and it's always interesting. So without further ado, Archie McConnel, would you like to come up?
Thanks very much, Nick. Nice to see you this evening. Annan is not bilingual, it's the wrong side of myth, but... to begin with, what I'm going to do, there's basically two things I'm going to talk about. One is how we actually look at the land around about us, and that includes the sea, the land and the landscape. And the other one is I shall be looking at the ships that I found on the maps. There's always nice little dinky drawings of ships on the sides of maps. And I've chased up some of those, and hopefully I'll be able to tell you the stories about them. So, if we go on. Roads. If you could help me out, Nick, and with this one. Looking at the far map there, you can see that on one side there's Thornhill, about 2/3 of the way up, and on the other side, there's nearer the top, there's Moffat. And if you were driving a car to those places, you would probably come all the way down to Dumfries and then back up again, back up the road. In the old days, you wouldn't have done that. You'd have walked straight across the hill, and it's only 15 odd miles. Okay, and the same thing happens here with the other map. Is if you're going from Dumfries to Annan, these days you zoom along the main roadway. In the old days, you wouldn't have done that because there wasn't a pass over the top of Loch Moss. So you'd have to come down the way and get to Annan by going nearer Calaverock, if you like. And then suddenly that makes sense too of why Calaverock's where it is, where the castle is. So when we're trying to look at the map, as it were, and trying to think of the way that older people, no, I don't mean older people, I mean ancient people, or peoples that had come before us had thought about the way that they'd looked at the place, it's very different to what we do now. Okay. Here's a really good example. There were lots of roads actually in the sea. The top one is about the bay of, it's Ross Bay, in fact, just down near Kirkcudbright. And it's quite keen on you just walking all over the beach and all through the bay, and it's a way that you would go, it's a way that you would travel. Down below, the three little vignettes of map come from the county map of Dumfriesshire, of Kirkcudbrightshire, which was done by Ainslie in 1793, 1797. These ones show you the tracks that you would have followed, not just simply crossing across a bay, but actually using them from going to A to B. And you can still walk along the shore these days, and it's a totally different experience from obviously going along the road. The other thing to consider is what sort of transport was around. We think of motor cars, and we go outside this building and we have, I don't know, just looking down the street, you can see, I was going to say 100 cars, probably, if you counted all the ones up that are parked along the roadside. If we look at this, this is a return for the cart tax. I think it's, 1785, okay? Now, there are only 5 carts that are registered here in Annan Borough. Now, there would have been more in the wider parish, but in the actual borough, there were 5 carts, okay? Now, each of those carts can only carry a ton, and that's how you're going to be moving stuff around or in bigger bulk, if you like. The other way is like this lady is doing here, who's collecting her peats, and you would stick it on your back and you would carry it. Now, that's 1780, that's not so long ago, really. Okay, so we're talking about a totally different transport system. The other big thing that goes on here is trains, if you like, of pack ponies. That's the other way of shifting things. And the problem is that the roads are so bad, that's the only way that you can get through very often. Okay. Nice first map. These two are very illuminating as far as I'm concerned. They are the spy maps that were done by the English, and this is reporting to Lord Wharton, who was the big cheese in Carlisle. And this particular document is in the British Library, and it's well worth a read if you want to go and find it. It's all about how many men these towns we have here on the right, that's Annan, I'm sure you recognized it. And on the left there is Kirkcudbright and St Mary's Isle. St Mary's Isle is that little bit there, and you can just see on the far right of the right-hand map there, you can see the town of Kirkcudbright. The big thing in both these maps is the estuary. And it was well recognized then that if you were going to have an attack on these places, you needed to control the sea. And you could ship your men in, not a problem, and it was dead easy to do. So here you have the plans, and with them go the words on these, and you can see how many men Annan can gather up in the next 24 hours or whatever it is, and you can, they've made notes about how many men it takes to hold Annan and to take Annan, or to raise it to the ground. Okay. Okay, so what kind of boats? I'm mainly going to be talking about the 18th and 19th century, so because this is when all the maps were done that I normally play with. And so what kind of boats were there around? And these are the real workhorses. Now remember, the cart was only going to give you 1 ton to ship around. These were like having a small truck. Okay, you're looking at 10 up to maybe 20 tons in the one boat. And when we talk about wherries, I don't think it's the right term at all, but it'll do. The people talk about Manx wherries, but it's really an English term. And but it's the small craft that were around on the Solway, and they have discovered some of them even in the Shoreline and such like, and they are, you know, historic Scotland have got their flags in a map somewhere where they're buried in the sand. So we know quite a lot about the sort of thing that they were doing. If you look up at the bit that says Shell Bank, for instance, these come from a map that was about 1780s, done by a guy called John Gillan. Gillan could not make a map without drawing a boat on it. We'll see. And we'll see quite a lot of his drawings, and I really love them. I think they're terrific. These guys on the top there, on the shell bank, what they're doing is actually digging up shells, putting them on the boat, floating them up the river to Kirkcudbright and on beyond to Tongland, where they would unload them, and the shells would be burnt for lime. Both for fertilizer and for making mortar. And there are shells, for instance, that you can find in some houses around and about that are still unburnt, and they're still in the mortar. And you up the hill someplace and you see these shells in there. So that's how they got there. And we actually know the names of some of these guys. There's a whole ticket of about the masters of these little ships. And there were 3 that regularly plied that particular route from Tongland down to Ross Bay, which is where they are, and back again. That was in 1810, so these may not be these guys. But there is a whole lot of information about them. They'd make 70 trips a year, for instance, working between April and November. But those boats would not just be used for doing the shells, they would also be used for shipping or quarrying, if you like, the rock around and about the seaside. And they would be put onto the boat. The tide would float it up again, and off you'd go with the tide as you took the load back home again. Shells, rock, and the third thing was seaweed was the other thing, which you'd also put out for fertilizer and such like. So these are real good little workhorses that are working agricultural, if you like, as well as for doing stuff for the town. This is the one great voyage made by one of these little boats. It was called the William of Dumfries, and in 1704 they wanted to build something called the mid-steeple in Dumfries, and they needed timber for that. So they looked all sorts of places, including, incidentally, importing it from the Baltic via Glasgow. So they had a jolly going up to Glasgow to see if they could find it, failed miserably, looked in various places around Dumfries and Galloway, and the place that they found was Creetown, or up the Cree. And it's the Cree Woods up just north of Newton Stewart, where the timber came from. The timber was chopped down. It was selected by the joiners who were going to use it, and they said they want these ones here. It was floated down the river, and we know all this because there's a book of a committee was put together to decide all this, and they had all the minutes of the committee were written up, and it's in the library in the Ewart in Dumfries. And you can see the big loop in the river there in the Cree. That is the Carsnore Loop, and it would have been loaded up there, probably on the eastern bank, I think, where the banks were steep. The boat could be pulled in next door to the bank. You roll the logs on, and off you go in the next high tide. And similarly, when you arrive, most of the time I think they were not sailing so much, but using the tides to go in and out and get up and down the Solway. And you would go further out for going up the way or down the way. I don't know, you know more about this than I do, Alan. But you would use the tide to make the boat do what you wanted it to do. And when you got to Dumfries, or got to the Nith, I should say, the place where you unloaded was not on the white sands. There was a whole lot of rocks in the way, and they weren't blown up until 1820s. So what you had to do was to unload at Kelton, which is about 4 miles south of Dumfries. And in those days, it was called Kelton Thorn, and I will come to Thorns in a minute. And when you get to Kelton Thorn, it's unloaded, put on the bank. They actually hired some guys to watch it overnight, just in case somebody ran off with it or the tide took it away. And we've even got the note of how much it costs to buy the string to make the raft that put it up the river the following day. So that was the voyage of the William of Dumfries, bringing it across. It made 2 voyages for this particular job that we know about. Navigation. How do you navigate? You can't dial it up on your telephone or whatever. That would be, I think, cheating, really. This, I think, is the best map, 1744, where Thomas Winter's version, and it's a really succinct map of the Solway. What I find fascinating is not all the big lines which you can follow and all the rest of it and doing your navigation with and triangulating this and that, which I don't really understand maths anyway. But if you look on the left-hand side there, you can see that there's the horizon that you can see from the sea. And just there you can see the criffle, that's the big lump on it. So you can have your map there and you can be looking out, and there is the horizon, and on your map it's all nicely shaped as well. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. Interesting one here is that on the point there where you would expect the southernmost lighthouse to be, it has something called a landmark. And it's something that looks very like a lighthouse, actually. But a light wasn't put into the lighthouse until about 1800. And that particular, again, it was Dumfries Committee stuff going on, and it was the Dumfries town that put up the light. I'll call it a light. It's difficult to know what it is if you haven't got a light in it. This thing standing up. But the interesting part is that didn't happen until 1748, but there's something here on Winter's map in 1744, so there had been a landmark for some time. Okie doke, how about ports and such like things? On the right-hand side, we've talked about Tongland already, okay, and you can see those little boats. They didn't have a key to go up to tie up to, they just had the strand, you can see it. That's from a map of 1770s, and you can see that there's absolutely nothing there except the sandy beach to go up to. So that's where they would dig off all their shells after they'd put them all on at the other end. Interesting one just below it, you can see it's the Carse Burn there going in. But the interesting part is that there are a couple of notes there which talk about horse wells. And you've got there The only reason that we know that that would have been used by boats is because it has horse wells. And the horse wells is like a service station for your horses to come and drink at when you go and get your cargo off the boats. So it's something that you see regularly next door to the beaches. And up at the top on the left is Glen Capel. The quay there was built in I can't remember my dates, 1744, 46, I think it was, it was built there. We know the first ship that went into the quay, and that was pretty much the first solid quay on the Solway, I think, apart from maybe some stuff at the far end at Port Patrick and such like. And what were the ships that went in? Here are two that are on a map of 1740 it was, that map. And there was two ships, you can just see the names of them. On the right-hand side is the Unity, and on the left-hand side is the Success. Now, this was on a Buccleuch map for a place called the Craigs, which was up on top of the hill just beyond Calaverock as you're going towards Dumfries. And these two boats would have been merchantmen that would have plied a trade going across to pick up tobacco, going to Portugal and Spain for wine and such like, maybe into Holland to do various things. And the other big thing would have been to pick up a few slaves in Africa. So it's not quite such a dinky kind of a thing as you might think. I think they're jolly little boats sitting on the sea, but it's a bit of a disappointment, if you like, that actually it's all founded on the slave trade. Okay, next one. This is an example of how it went. This is a 1749 note, which is about ships going out from Bristol. And you can see the list starts 1, 2, 3, and then it carries on. And number 20 there on the right-hand side is the Success. So that's pretty likely that that is where it was in 1749. So it was bringing in 320 slaves, and the value of the cargo was £4,400. Now, where did it get them from? It was in the map there, Nigeria map. We're looking at Calabar, Bonny, and Benin, and you can find them on the map. Now, where did they actually go after they'd put them on? Now, it could have been that they went to the Caribbean, so to Jamaica or somewhere like that. But also the other place that needed slaves was for the tobacco industry. And if you look on the left-hand side, you can see a red dot in the middle, just below Washington. And that is on the Potomac and is very near Quantico, the Marine base. And it is a place called Dumfries, which was founded, oddly enough, in 1749 by a guy called Graham. And there's lots of locals, if you like, who are out in that sort of an area. And he was a tobacco factor. And so, and the area that the tobacco came into most was actually in the southwest and into Glasgow, as far as Scotland was concerned. Now, that was the Success. That was what that was up to. I did find a note of a ship called the Unity as well. But that was in 1767, so it's all a little bit dodgy as to whether it was the same Unity or not. And, but the interesting thing about this particular ship was that it went to get a whole lot of cowrie shells, which come from the Maldives. The place to get those was in Amsterdam because the Dutch had brought them in. Now, why you want shells is a bizarre kind of a thing, but that particular shell was used as a monetary currency across the south of Asia and also into Africa. And these shells were essentially used to purchase slaves in Africa. And so that's why the ship had gone to Holland to purchase the shells. On the top right, this is a picture of some of the justices of the USA at Trump's inauguration, with a suitable expression on their faces. The lady second from the left, wearing the necklace of cowrie shells, is doing so to make a political point. The point being that the cowrie shells were something that was used to buy slaves. The other part of the cowrie shell was that it was supposed to keep you away from evil spirits. If we can. Okay, we're still looking at tobacco here. Now, in Castle Douglas, which is very near the sea, but not really very near the sea, and unless Carling Walk has got a lot bigger, it's really strange that this is a map of the borough of Castle Douglas, and in the vignette at the bottom with the cartouche, you have little sailing ships sailing along in a sea. And you go, eh? And the bottom left-hand corner, I've blown up to be on the right-hand side there, and the reason becomes clear. You've got tobacco leaves. Okay, so the guy who, Mr. Douglas, who founded Castle Douglas, did so on the back of a tobacco fortune. And thus the tobacco leaves on the map. I can't really talk about the Solway without talking about this guy. I'm not really a fan, to be frank. He was also, he spent about 4 years in the, slave trade. And he said it was an abominable trade. But on the other hand, he had a good track record of flogging his men, amongst other things. I won't go into what happened in Moscow with 10-year-old young ladies, but that's a different matter altogether. But if you think about all the things that we've been talking about with the winter map and seeing the horizons and such like, this guy knew very well what was happening up the Solway. So when he came with the Ranger to try and take away the Earl of Selkirk, which he failed miserably to do, this was a joke, I think, that Gillen put on the bottom of his map. It was a little picture of John Paul Jones's Ranger off to try and kidnap the Earl of Selkirk. Anyway, I don't think John Paul Jones was a particularly pleasant man, but that's my personal opinion. Just sort of winding up, there are all sorts of boats, and I feel a bit like a con merchant because I don't know which one's which, to be frank. And I find they're all quite pretty to look at. Sloops and brigantines and all these things. But in this picture, if you look on the left-hand side there, that's Little Ross Island just in the middle at the bottom, and above it, there's a ship that's at anchor. And one of the things that we do know is that that particular place was very much used as a a place to go and shelter from storms and such like. So that's what's happening in that particular little vignette. Okay, and just to finish up with smuggling. Now, we've talked about all the different boats and such like, and it would have been bigger boats that would be bringing the goods into the area. But quite often, it wouldn't be them that would be landing it. And you've got all these little craft wandering around the Solway that someone can just heave a couple of bales of tobacco into, or a couple of barrels of whatever, and send on its way. And that, I think, is how most of the smuggling got done. But there was also a secondary way. Manx wherries were around and about as well. And quite a lot of the time you see Manxmen, Manxman's Point or Manxman's something or other on the side of, on the maps as you go along the coast. And the relationship with the Isle of Man is interesting in that there were organizations, we'll call them, on the Isle of Man that would buy in bulk. And then there was one particular guy that used to get large barrels of wine and spirits and such like, and then rebottle it before he landed it on the Solway coast. And that, you know, we got barrels here, but it's all a question of how you get the big stuff into smaller stuff so that you can ship it on to the local populace. That's not to say that big amounts of shipping didn't arrive in and offload onto the shoreline, but quite a lot of it would have been done with those small wherry-type boats. And it looks like I'm winding up. I'd just like to say that Gillen's pictures, I think, are wonderful, and this particular little vignette that's on the screen at the minute is actually only about 2.5 inches high on the map. Okay, so you can see the sort of detail that we went into it. Thanks very much, Nick.
Thank you, Archie. That's excellent. Now, before we move over, we've got time for a couple of questions, if any from the audience. I've got a question here from Stephen Hughes in the Lancaster area. It says, Archie, was there any movement on foot or horse you're aware of along or across the sands of the Solway? I'm thinking of the routes that we have near me across the sands from Lancaster area to South Lakeland. Does any of that appear on any of the maps?
There are more up this end of the Solway, which show, and I was trying to remember, it was Tobias Smollett, or who was it? There was a very funny piece where some travellers had fallen in with another traveller, and they'd become good friends overnight in the local hostelry. And this other traveller had set out early, and they followed him across the sands towards Carlisle. But this was going, you know, properly across the sands. It wasn't, you know, round by road or anything like that. So it was a very quick, short cut across. And they discovered his horse that had obviously drowned. And they went on very grim-faced to get onto land again, thinking that the guy had been drowned and had been taken out to sea. And but no, it was there he was sitting having a pint at his at the next hostelry. But
cheerful, yeah, for the chap, but less cheerful for the horse.
I am sorry about his horse.
But, well, thank you very much, Archie. But we'll bring our next guest up now, Alan Thomson. For people who know Alan, he's the, sort of like the power behind the Annan Harbour. run skiffs, etc., and been from this area farming for many, many years. So without any further ado, Alan, would you like to come up and tell us about your projects?
Thank you very much, Nick. Unlike Archie, this is my native habitat. So there we have it, Annan Harbour, on a very sunny day in October 2021, when Annan Harbour Action Group took possession of that large building on the left, and indeed the Minister's Merce. We raised a flag. That's a wide-angle shot in case anybody's wondering how it works. There seems to be a kind of bend in it. Okay, Nick. I'd like to show you this little tiny bit of film, because people often ask, how do ships actually get up the Annan? Next slide, please, Nick. We haven't time to show you the whole film. It's 5 minutes. Google La Malouine, which is this ship, coming into Annan in August 2022. It's a film by George Witchett. It brings a tear to the eye. It appears across the headline, it turns in and comes steaming up the river in majestic sight and then gets stuck in a gravel bank. You don't see it getting stuck in a gravel bank. The particular picture that's up now is actually last year when she came in September. She had to turn round, the picture on the right, she had to turn round and come in backwards to the quay. And she's still down there and welcoming visitors any day of the week, as long as you don't turn up before 11. So, look, some background facts and figures about Annan Harbour, a little bit of potted history, and I need to put the glasses on for this part. I'm very good with dates, but I get them all mixed up all the time. 1625, following on from what Archie said, the Convention of Royal Boroughs stationed a sloop at the mouth of the River Annan to, shall we say, discourage the free trade. Smuggling was rife in Annan at the time. In 1790, the council in its wisdom put in a lade, what we call the dam, which put water down from just below where the road bridge is now, down the side of Port Street to produce water, to keep a channel open. The borough funds were provided in 1805 to build the first quay and a warehouse at what was called the Well. And then in 1810, finally, there was a subscription quay built at the harbour. And later, it was actually Thomas Telford's office, not necessarily the great man, because I think he was doing something in Sweden at the time. Telford's office made the drawing. Further extensions were added to that quay in 1893 and 1904, and that's basically the structure that you can see now at the harbour. The other key date for Annan Harbour was 1817, when a guy called John Irvine of Newby Estates built the flood banks on either side of the Lower Annan, particularly to enclose what's called the Hall Meadow on the eastern side, and the land belonging to what was called then Barnkirk Farm on the western side. It cost £3,000 back in those days, but it was a heck of a good investment, because he got himself approximately 350 acres of really prime arable land, and the price of grain at that time was absolutely through the roof. And also the bonus was that ships of up to 300 tons could come into Annan. That little ship we saw at the beginning was 100 tons. So much bigger ships could come in. In 1810, a famous chap in Annan, John Nicholson, coming from a family farm up at Mousel called the Hoothet, bought himself into a slate importing business. And being a young and thrusting entrepreneur, and there was a building boom on at the time, he also got himself into the importation of timber and of cement. That meant he was dealing with ships coming in, and he was at the mercy of the various shipping companies. So being the entrepreneur that he was, he decided he would build his own ships. So undaunted, he built a few sloops on the shore at Newby by the simple expedient of sending horses and carts up to the local woods at Kinmount and thereabouts, so Kilhead. Cut down some trees and built some sloops and suddenly was in the shipping business. He didn't actually move into Annan until about 1818 when they took over a yard just above the Welldale. Now I mentioned the bit of a building boom that he was helping fuel with his business. Timber became very scarce. This is after the Napoleonic Wars. There was a bit of a boom going on, so the price of timber suddenly rocketed, and instead of going to up the Cree, he decided that he would go off to North America to look for wood to build his ships. And he and his master carpenter went off to a place called Richie Bucto, which is in New Brunswick, which at that time was in New Brunswick. It didn't become Canada for quite a while. Nevertheless, they rolled up there, and the Annan version of this story is that Nicholson hired 20 local carpenters and stationed them in a yard beside a sawmill. The Canadians now, a family called Jardine in particular, tell it a slightly different story. They say they welcomed him to their shipbuilding yard, but they hadn't actually built a ship yet. So there's a little bit of synergy going on there. I think they both learned from each other. He learned about the fine pioneer timber that was coming out of that island and the ones round about it, and they learned how to build ships. And he built this, the Helen Douglas, and the first ship built by the Jardines was called the Nellie Douglas. It's too much of a coincidence, I think. So basically they built that little ship in one single season, i.e. he rolled up there in May, hired his guys. Perhaps the trees were there waiting for him, we don't really know, but in about 3 months he built that little ship, which is 88 feet long, it's 25 feet wide, and it draws 16 feet in the beam. As soon as it was built, it wasn't even, paint wasn't dry, they filled it up with massive timbers, sailed it back to Annan, and the legend goes that he got as much for the timber because it was in huge demand. He didn't build ships with the first load, he sold it to pay for the boat building. That little ship sailed across the Atlantic for 50 years, which is absolutely unheard of in those days. Sometimes twice in one season. It's only 88 feet long. You wouldn't go to the Isle of Man in it, frankly. It's absurd that they could even think of going across an ocean in a little ship like that. It made the Nicholson family fortunes over that period. And the way that worked, ships were offered to investors in blocks of 8 shares up to 64. So the skipper got 8 shares, the Nicholson family had 32 shares, and whoever wanted to take cargo in it could buy shares and for that particular voyage. So it was a real money spinner. Ended up in Whitehaven as a coal hulk, unfortunately, as many ships did, but it was a fabulous little ship. Nicholson went on to build 53 significant vessels from his yard in Port Street. Initially, it's more or less at the bottom of Port Street, but they had to move when the railway came through in 1848, so they moved further down to where Cookie's Yard is just now. And of those 53 ships, 6 were designated as clippers. This is the Queensbury, the greyhounds of the sea. These things were absolutely built for nothing but speed. They went faster than you could believe. And although steamships were on the go, these things basically were powered by the wind, so they could go massive distances really, really quickly. Of the ones they built in Annan, the first one was in 1854. That was the Annandale, which, when it was launched, was the longest ship for its beam in the world. So it was a long, narrow tube. Indeed, they all were, but that was very noticeable about that one at the time. The Annandale did Liverpool to Melbourne in 79 days, which was pretty astounding stuff. Picked up a load of wool and came back. The Queensbury, this one, 635 tons. The next one that was built was the Shakespeare. It did Fuchow to deal with a load of tea in 128 days, so that was, you know, pretty competitive at that time. And then they began to name them after family members. So the John Nicholson was built in 1859, the Elizabeth Nicholson, 904 tons in 1863, and the last of all and the biggest, Sarah Nicholson, in 1867, and the last. As I said, they were a bit of an anachronism even in those days. For shorter journeys, steam was much more efficient, and it was only because they couldn't carry coal that they couldn't go and get the tea in China at that time. Nicholson saw the writing on the wall. He packed up his shipyard, he invested in railways, made another fortune, and the men were the best craftsmen you could imagine. They went off to South Wales, and indeed some ended up building the Cutty Sark in Dumbarton. And there are families in Annan whose ancestors went to Dumbarton for the duration of building that ship. So yeah, next please. Here we have some grain ships at Annan Quay. We don't know the date exactly, but we know it's before 1904 and after 1893. Most of the trade in Annan was in connection with the surrounding farming country and agricultural industry. It was bringing in, sometimes from Liverpool, sometimes internationally, stuff that goes into compounds for cattle feed. Even in the mid-Victorian times, they were bringing in tapioca and maize and various other foodstuffs to blend for cattle feed. And this is sort of the mid-Victorian times was the heyday for quantities of ships coming into Annan. And I'll just read out what a report to the commissioners, which was the predecessor to the Board of Trade, said in 1853. It said that the accommodations of the harbour at Annan have been considerably improved of late, and the trade is said to be on the increase. There were 33 vessels amounting to 2,264 tons in all belonging to the port. Those are the ones that were in and out of Annan all the time. And actually in the year 1832, October to October to 1833, 532 vessels entered inwards and 131 were cleared outwards, with 5 going foreign. Now that sort of means, if you follow it, that lots of boats were ended up in Annan and not going anywhere. But actually, if they didn't have a cargo going out, they didn't need to be cleared, so they just went off. So some of them were handballed up the river, and others got the benefit of a tug later on. That sort of maintained for 20, 30 years, because in 1844 there were 544 coasters came in, bringing in just shy of 60,000 tons worth of cargo. And again, in that year, there were 8 for foreign. Thanks, Nick. This is a slightly more modern one, and we think this one is a little bit later, so it's, you know, very late photography, late Victorian. Some people say this is an Annan photograph, but the photographer Annan from Glasgow is quite famous, but I think that one might be just a little bit of a myth. We know that a couple of these were Maryport boats, and notice the steamer in the middle. That steamer would have dragged up these 2 other grain boats. The steamer would probably have coal on it, and they would pick it up probably at Whitehaven or perhaps Maryport, and bring them into Annan and take them back, so they didn't have to worry about the vagaries of the weather and the tide. So let's just go to the next slide. So I'll tell you a little story about this wonderful little ship, which is it's quite heroic when you think about it, crossing the Atlantic all those times. In 1853, a guy called Miller, William Miller Jr. came to Annan. William Miller Sr. left a bog hole at the other side of Wintershoe, where he tried to farm. As a young man, he went to Ontario. He did really, really well. His land was cleared early, and he got himself a reputation for breeding the finest stock. in the province at that time. So he sent his younger son off back to Scotland to buy some stock. So young William bowled up in 1853, came to stay in Newby, staying with James Beattie at Newby House. James Beattie was a renowned stockman locally at that time. He had a very famous black bull which won all sorts of rosettes in Paris. But when they were bringing it home, unfortunately, it took seasick on the boat and didn't make the journey home, which was a bit of a blow after having gone all that way. But anyway, Beattie was able to show Miller all the farms round about that had the best stock. And these are all named, and it's really quite interesting to see the peregrination that he did over a couple of months in the winter of 53, 54. And he was particularly interested in shorthorn cows, which were a new thing at that time, and Galloways to a lesser extent. He also managed to buy a really good Clydesdale stallion, a Clydesdale mare, a couple of colts. He bought dogs. He bought 40 Border Leicester sheep, which were a new breed at the time, and ducks and hens. So he bowls down to Liverpool and expects to book passage for his menagerie on the steamer that he came over on, and they wouldn't entertain it and said they didn't deal with livestock in their trade. And when he talked to the other shippers out of Liverpool, they wanted an astronomical amount to ship these cattle. So what did he do? He came back to Annan. He hired the Helen Douglas, and she was just going through her annual maintenance, because to keep the ship going that long, they really did have to have a strict regime about looking after her. So she was stripped down, any worn or rot was cut out, and she was clagged in tar once again. And I don't know if you've noticed, that's the mouth of the Annan behind there. So somebody somewhere in a studio has painted the front bit, and perhaps somebody else has put the Annan bit on afterwards, or vice versa. But if he's got that amount of sail up in that position, he's in deep trouble. So it was a bit of an artifice on the point of view of the artist. So the ship was dragged down to the steamer pier at Waterfoot, and it wasn't like Noah's Ark. The animals didn't go on 2 by 2. They were unceremoniously put into slings, and the guy with a hand winch winched them over, and you can imagine what excitement that caused. The ship doesn't actually have any deck other than the top deck, so the hold had to be, a false floor had to be put in the hold. So the shipyard provided offcuts, slabs off the side of logs, and these were laid for the animals across the beams in the hold of the little ship for the animals to stand on. And where there was restricted height, it was only about 4 feet at the forecastle, so the sheep went up there. Further back, the cattle were tied to the sides of the boats, and the poor horses, there was no place with headroom for the Clydesdales, so they stood underneath the hatch cover, and a temporary canvas solution was quickly knocked up so that the poor things didn't get battered by the weather. Now, you could think, what are they going to do with the manure, etc.? Well, that fell down the slats in the slabs into the bottom of the boat, into the bilges, where the ship kept its water barrels. So it's basically sand, water barrels and sand with animal manure dropping down on it. So you understand now why the shippers in Liverpool weren't keen. So on the 1st of April, 1854, off it went. It was taken by tug out to Robin Rig, and then set on its way, and it made really good passage. It got to just off Quebec in exactly 5 weeks, but unfortunately spring was a bit later across there, and they hung around for 2 weeks waiting for the ice to melt. So 7 weeks to there, and then they were forwarded down the rivers of Canada to Ontario. The only losses apparently were 3 sheep. Now, if you kept 3 sheep over the winter out of 40, they'd have died anyway. So, I mean, they did a good job of looking after them. He took quite a well-known stockman with him, actually, and that stockman became quite famous in Canada. Another guy from Newby that we haven't time to talk about today. The stallion, Rob Roy, is the progenitor of all the best Clydesdales in Canada now. And there's been recent talk about bringing Canadian bloodlines into Scotland to boost the local breeding. But unfortunately, poor Rob Roy died in a barn fire only a couple of years after he landed there. But his memory and his stock lingers on, and he's probably the only horse that's crossed the Atlantic with his head sticking out in the weather. So that's a little bit about the ships. This slide is a little bit about what's going to happen to Annan Harbour in the next couple of years. And as you can see, it's going to change its function and become more of a leisure destination. We're going to have a lagoon for people to kayak and to sport themselves on paddle boards. We're told that people will wild swim in there. I'll believe that when I see it. So that's done by putting a dam across the dam. And we're having a bridge, and the thing in the middle, the curly thing and the snail-like thing in the middle, is a amphitheatre, which serves three functions. It means we can get people up to the main door of the building, which will be a visitor attraction. It'll get them up to a level where they can cross by a bridge to visit the Minister's Merse, and they can use it as a viewing platform for small performances, or people, mums to watch their kids sailing boats, etc., etc. And then on the Minister's Merse, which is 4 metres deep in ashes, we're going to increase the biodiversity, which isn't going to be hard really, and turn that into a little bit of a nature reserve where people can look at the river from viewpoints and watch birds from bird hides. And the key is going to be an event space, and also in the building we'll have additional community facilities. So please come and get involved and tell us what you'd like to see happening there, because if we leave it much longer, there won't be time to make any changes that you might like to see. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes.
We have a number of questions coming in online. So I'll put you on the spot, and there'll be some questions, I'm sure, from the audience as well. So the first one comes from Richard Bellamy. Alan, can you say whether any of the Annan-built ships had twin keels to prevent them listing when the tide was out? I think for your livestock story, it made it doubly difficult if they were having to sit there on their side being loaded in. So did the boats keel over?
The initial coasters were made much in the same way as the old-fashioned puffers, and they were designed to be beached and unloaded. The clipper ships certainly weren't. They had massive keels and indeed were copper sheathed, so they wouldn't take kindly to touching anything on the bottom. But the little coasters were designed to go into places where they would dry out, and a couple of the ones we saw in the pictures would indeed lean against the wall and sit on the bottom. Right. Not with twin keels though. Right.
So it's a relatively flat bottom boat then. And the clippers, they could only stay in for a very short period of time in the harbour then.
The clippers, once they were launched, never ever could come back to Annan. They were just too big. Right. And indeed, the later ones were so big that they didn't even have their masts put on. They were tugged down to Liverpool to get the mast stepped. And latterly, they were also taken down to either Liverpool or Swansea to get sheathed in copper to make them even faster.
It's actually quite difficult to imagine Annan Harbour and River Annan building the longest boat currently made at that time. Because it's a lovely river, a lovely estuary, but it's quite petite compared to the Clyde.
The logistics of it were quite incredible. They actually cut a hole in the flood bank by hand so that the ship could be launched through it, and then filled it in behind it and didn't open it up again until next year. It's an incredible feat.
Blimey.
Right. And long before the days of drag lines and JCBs, this was guys with shovels and barrows.
Another question then on the use of the harbour then. Was it ever used as a passenger harbour? So Stephen Hughes is talking about with any passenger services.
Yeah, the passenger services went from the Waterfoot because there was water there for longer. There was 2 piers, there was 2 different companies. There was the Carlisle and Liverpool and the Carlisle, Liverpool and Annan steam navigation companies. And they ran in competition for some years and were only put out of business really when the railways started to come along. So the service to Liverpool meant you could leave Annan on the tide in the morning, you were in Liverpool 14 hours later. And there was a big trade in cattle. Some years there was as many as 2,000 or 3,000 cattle going from Annan to Liverpool, and sort of like 20,000 sheep to feed the masses in the city.
Okay. There's more questions coming in. There'll be some questions from the audience as well, I'm sure. But Anna, sees quite a lot of excitement online about the Annan Harbour development. So Anna is looking at what's the time frame? Is it definitely happening? She said it looks fantastic, and how can we find out more? So Anna's used up 7 questions, I think, there.
Okay. Well, Annan's very welcome to come and have a look anytime she likes. Just give us a call. Yeah, we've got an absolute finish deadline of March 28. We will this year be appointing a project manager. The project manager will work with our technical team, who have been working really hard for 2 years to develop the plan, and they will at that point, probably in August, put out the stage 1 tender for the contractor to build what we saw on the screen.
That's brilliant. And that'll be sort of like, within SCAMP, we'll be sort of like really looking at this project, and there's huge resources that hopefully we can bring in to sort of help some of this along. So it's really exciting for the town. Okay, if there's any more questions from the audience, but lastly I'd like to say that there is one more event in Annan this Friday. It's not an event like this, it's actually an activity event where you can join Galloway Fisheries Trust at the mouth of the River Annan and have a look at the fish of the inner Solway and what fish are using it. So if you can go on to the SCAMP Facebook page, you'll be able to find the details about it. It'll keep being reposted. But that's about 2 o'clock, I think it starts, this coming Friday. Now, I think the only thing we should do now really is a round of applause to both Archie and Alan, who've been brilliant and kept everyone interested all evening. And thank you to everyone online, and we'll see you at another event soon.